General George S. Patton is dead. Officially, the war's most aggressive American commander is remembered for controversy, the slapping incidents, the reckless speeches, the political embarrassment he caused Allied leadership. Newspapers speak cautiously. Public statements are controlled. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, issues a respectful but restrained tribute. But behind closed doors, something changes. The man who had spent years restraining Patton, limiting his fuel, his movement, his freedom, finally speaks without consequence. And what Eisenhower privately admits after Patton's death is not what history first heard. This documentary examines what Eisenhower finally acknowledged, why Patton was indispensable yet impossible, and how the Allied war effort lost its most dangerous weapon the moment he died. The truth emerges only after silence became safe.
Long before Normandy or the Battle of the Bulge, George Patton and Dwight Eisenhower were not rivals. They were collaborators. Their relationship dates back to the interwar years, when Eisenhower was still an obscure officer struggling for advancement. Patton, already known for his mechanized warfare theories and battlefield intensity, introduced Eisenhower to senior figures who mattered. In military circles, patronage mattered as much as performance. Patton recognized Eisenhower's organizational brilliance. Eisenhower recognized Patton's raw combat instinct. Yet even then, the fault line was clear. Eisenhower believed wars were won through coalition management, logistics, and discipline. Patton believed wars were won by relentless pressure, speed, and shock. They needed each other, but they did not think alike. When America entered World War II in December 1941, Eisenhower rose rapidly through staff command. Patton was sidelined, then resurrected, then restrained, repeatedly. This was not personal animosity. It was fear of what Patton unleashed once released.
By 1943, Eisenhower had absolute responsibility, not just to win the war, but to hold the alliance together. Patton threatened that balance. He insulted allies, he ignored political optics, he spoke too freely about post-war conflict with the Soviet Union. And yet, whenever Patton was allowed to fight, he delivered results. Sicily, France, the breakout after Normandy. Patton's Third Army advanced faster than Allied planning models predicted. He exploited chaos rather than feared it. But that speed terrified Allied leadership. A single uncontrolled advance could fracture supply lines, embarrass allies, or provoke political fallout. So Eisenhower restrained him. Fuel allocations were cut, operations were delayed, momentum was slowed, not because Patton failed, but because he succeeded too dangerously. As one viewer insightfully noted decades later, Patton was a warrior, not a politician. Eisenhower understood this and limited him accordingly.
When Patton died following a car accident in Germany, the risk vanished. No more scandals, no more political damage, no more press crises. Only then did Eisenhower speak freely, not in speeches, but in private reflections and later writings. He acknowledged what many officers had known, but few dared articulate. Patton imposed momentum through sheer will. He broke stalemates no committee could solve. He turned chaos into advantage. Eisenhower did not say Patton was easy. He did not say Patton was manageable. He admitted something far more revealing. Patton was irreplaceable in war and unusable in peace. And only after his death did Eisenhower fully accept what had been lost. The final admission comes later.
By late summer 1944, the war in Western Europe entered its most consequential phase. Patton's Third Army had broken out of Normandy and was advancing faster than any Allied force. German units were collapsing in retreat. Roads were clogged with abandoned equipment. For the first time since D-Day, the possibility of a rapid war-ending advance appeared real. But logistics, not enemy resistance, became the choke point. Eisenhower faced an impossible equation: limited fuel, overstretched supply lines, and competing demands from Allied commanders. He chose balance over concentration. Fuel was redistributed away from Patton to support a broader front, including Montgomery's planned offensive in the north. To Patton, this was strategic suffocation. His armored columns slowed not because they were defeated, but because they ran dry. Momentum, his greatest weapon, evaporated. Eisenhower understood Patton's frustration, but believed coalition unity mattered more than individual brilliance. This decision would later haunt post-war debate.
Eisenhower's restraint was not only logistical, it was political. Patton had already proven himself a liability off the battlefield. His public comments about post-war Germany, the Soviet Union, and military governance alarmed Allied leaders. British officials complained openly. American politicians worried privately. Eisenhower's role demanded control. He could not allow one general, no matter how effective, to threaten the fragile alliance holding the war together. In Eisenhower's calculus, Patton's victories came with unacceptable political risk. This is why Eisenhower never removed Patton, but never unleashed him either. The Supreme Commander saw Patton clearly: a force multiplier in combat, a destabilizer in diplomacy. Keeping him constrained was not punishment, it was containment. Only after Patton's death would Eisenhower admit how much potential remained locked behind that restraint.
On December 16, 1944, the German army launched its last major offensive through the Ardennes. The Allied front cracked. What followed revealed why Eisenhower had both feared and needed Patton. Within hours, Patton pivoted the Third Army north, a maneuver many believed impossible. His forces moved faster than German intelligence anticipated, striking the flank of the offensive and relieving Bastogne. This was Patton at his best: improvisational, aggressive, decisive. No committee could have planned it. No cautious commander would have attempted it. Eisenhower later acknowledged privately that Patton's response saved the Allied line. Yet even here, Patton was acting within limits, still constrained, still managed. The victory was undeniable. The discomfort remained. As the war moved toward its end, Eisenhower began to see the contradiction clearly. When the front was stable, Patton was dangerous. When the front collapsed, Patton was indispensable. In private reflections, Eisenhower acknowledged something he never stated publicly during Patton's lifetime. No other American commander could generate momentum like Patton. Not Montgomery, not Bradley, not any staff-driven plan. Patton thrived where systems failed. Yet Eisenhower also understood why he could never say this aloud while Patton lived. Praise would embolden him. Freedom would multiply risk. Control was the price of alliance survival. Only after Patton's death did Eisenhower finally separate the man from the myth and admit the truth that war had already proven. The final admission was still coming. By March 1945, the German army in the West was finished. The Rhine had been crossed. Resistance was fragmented. Entire German formations surrendered without fighting. Patton's Third Army surged through central Germany with the same speed that had once alarmed Eisenhower. Yet even now, Patton was restrained. Operational boundaries were enforced. Objectives were limited. Political considerations, especially coordination with the Soviet advance from the east, dictated Allied movement more than battlefield opportunity. Patton wanted Berlin. Eisenhower did not. The Supreme Allied Commander believed the political cost of a race to Berlin outweighed the military benefit. The city lay deep within the Soviet zone agreed upon at Yalta. Capturing it would not change the post-war map, only the casualty lists. To Patton, this logic was intolerable. To Eisenhower, it was responsibility.
Patton never accepted Eisenhower's decision on Berlin. In private conversations and diary entries, he argued that Allied forces could reach the city first, and should. He believed allowing the Soviets to take Berlin would shape the post-war world in dangerous ways. Eisenhower disagreed. His war was not about symbolic capitals. It was about ending the conflict with minimal Allied casualties while preserving the alliance that had won it. Years later, critics would claim the war could have ended sooner, that Patton, given fuel and freedom, could have shattered German resistance entirely. Eisenhower never publicly argued this point, but privately he acknowledged that Patton's instincts were often correct, even when his methods were unacceptable. This tension defined their relationship until the end.
Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945. For Eisenhower, the war in Europe had ended successfully. The alliance held, the objectives were achieved. For Patton, victory brought frustration. He clashed openly with occupation policies. He spoke bluntly about Soviet intentions. He dismissed political caution as weakness. These comments alarmed Washington and embarrassed Allied leadership. Eisenhower relieved Patton of the Third Army command. Publicly, it was framed as routine reassignment. Privately, it was the final act of restraint. Patton was no longer needed to fight, and therefore no longer tolerated.
On December 9, 1945, Patton was injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. He died 12 days later. The reaction was swift, controlled, and cautious. Official statements praised his service while minimizing controversy. Eisenhower issued a respectful tribute, nothing more. But privately, Eisenhower spoke differently. With Patton gone, the political danger disappeared. There was no longer a reason to restrain the truth. Only then did Eisenhower allow himself to acknowledge what Patton had represented, a commander who could impose order through violence of motion when systems failed and plans collapsed. The admission was not public. Yet.
In later reflections, Eisenhower admitted something no wartime press release ever suggested. Patton was not reckless, he was singular. He could not be managed like other generals because he did not fight like them. He imposed momentum by presence alone. He thrived in chaos and converted disorder into advantage. Eisenhower did not regret restraining Patton, but he acknowledged that no one else could replace him. Patton was the kind of commander a war requires and peace cannot tolerate. That was Eisenhower's final realization, and history would spend decades arguing whether restraint saved lives or cost them.
Eisenhower did not issue a dramatic confession about Patton. What he offered instead, in private correspondence, post-war interviews, and later reflections, was something more revealing: context. He acknowledged that Patton possessed an instinct for operational warfare unmatched among the American commanders. Patton did not wait for perfect conditions. He exploited weakness the moment it appeared. Eisenhower admitted that this quality could not be taught and could not be replaced. But Eisenhower also clarified why he never fully unleashed him. Patton's strength was indivisible from his volatility. The same force of will that drove armies forward could fracture alliances just as quickly. Eisenhower understood Patton's value precisely because he had to limit it. Only after Patton's death could Eisenhower admit this without reopening wartime fault lines.
Few decisions have generated more post-war debate than Eisenhower's fuel allocations in late 1944. Critics argue that redirecting fuel from Patton to support Montgomery's northern operations slowed the Allied advance, extended the war, and cost lives. Some believe Patton, fully supplied, could have shattered German resistance before winter set in. Eisenhower never dismissed these arguments outright, but he rejected certainty. From his perspective, supply lines were fragile, ports were limited, and the risk of a catastrophic overextension was real. A single stalled thrust deep in Germany could have invited disaster. Eisenhower later acknowledged that Patton's requests were militarily sound but strategically dangerous in coalition war. History, he believed, could debate outcomes. Command could not gamble on them.
After the war, comparisons emerged, not from Patton himself, but from those who studied him. Historians and veterans placed Patton in the lineage of Grant and Sherman, commanders who understood that wars are not won by caution, but by relentless pressure. Eisenhower did not object to this comparison. Privately, he agreed. But he also recognized the difference between 19th-century wars and 20th-century coalitions. Grant and Sherman answered to one government. Patton answered to many: British, American, political, diplomatic. Eisenhower believed Patton belonged to an older mold of warfare, devastatingly effective, but increasingly incompatible with modern alliances. That recognition was not criticism, it was acknowledgement.
Eisenhower's greatest fear was not that Patton would fail. It was that he would succeed uncontrollably. A rapid, unilateral advance could have embarrassed allies, disrupted agreements with the Soviets, or altered post-war realities beyond civilian control. Eisenhower's task was not only to win battles, but to end the war without igniting the next one. Patton did not think this way, and Eisenhower knew it. He restrained Patton not because he doubted his brilliance, but because brilliance without restraint could unravel everything the alliance had built. This was the burden of supreme command.
In the end, Eisenhower admitted something simple and profound. When the war demanded speed, audacity, and momentum, Patton was unmatched. When the war demanded restraint, diplomacy, and silence, Patton was impossible. Eisenhower did not believe he misused Patton, but he acknowledged that history would always ask the same question. What might have happened if Patton had been given just a little more freedom? Eisenhower understood that question because he had lived it. And only after Patton was gone did he allow himself to say so. Eisenhower never stood at a podium and declared Patton irreplaceable. Such a statement would have undermined everything he represented as Supreme Allied Commander: restraint, unity, civilian control of the military. Publicly elevating Patton above other commanders would have reopened wartime divisions and validated criticisms Eisenhower had spent years containing.
Eisenhower believed history should judge commanders collectively, not elevate individuals at the expense of alliance success. Privately, however, he allowed a different truth to stand. Patton was exceptional, and exceptions are dangerous things to celebrate openly.
After Patton's death, some officers quietly speculated about the future. Had he lived, would Patton have commanded in Korea? Eisenhower never answered this question directly, but his later handling of General Douglas MacArthur offers a clue. MacArthur, like Patton, was brilliant and politically uncontrollable. Eisenhower removed him. The pattern was clear. Eisenhower valued decisive commanders, but only within limits. Patton may have won battles in Korea. He may also have widened the war. Eisenhower understood this tension better than anyone.
In conversations with historians and trusted aides, Eisenhower finally allowed himself one clear admission. When chaos threatened to overwhelm Allied operations, Patton imposed order through motion. Not plans, not committees. Movement. Eisenhower acknowledged that no other American general could replicate that effect. Patton did not merely command units, he energized them. This was not praise offered lightly. It was recognition earned in war, and spoken only after silence carried no risk.
Eisenhower never believed Patton could be replaced, only managed. Other generals could follow doctrine. Patton created opportunity. But genius carries cost. Patton embarrassed allies, alarmed politicians, and ignored consequences beyond the battlefield. Eisenhower understood that these flaws were inseparable from Patton's strengths. To remove the flaws would have removed the general. That was the tragedy.
History has never settled the argument. Some believe Eisenhower's restraint prevented catastrophe. Others believe it extended the war and increased suffering. Eisenhower never claimed certainty. He believed leadership meant choosing the option least likely to fail, not the one most likely to succeed spectacularly. That belief guided every decision he made about Patton. Patton and Eisenhower were not opposites. They were complements. One created momentum, the other controlled it. The war required both. Eisenhower understood that only after Patton was gone.
Eisenhower's final admission was never dramatic. It was quiet. Patton was the commander he most feared and most relied upon. He restrained him because he understood him. That is not contradiction. It is command.
Patton remains debated because he forces uncomfortable questions. Should wars be won quickly, at any cost, or carefully, at uncertain cost? Eisenhower chose caution. Only after Patton died did he admit what that choice required. Not regret, but restraint.
Most people who watch this channel aren't subscribed. If you believe World War II history deserves to be told carefully, not sensationalized, subscribing is how you help make that possible. It costs nothing, but it makes a real difference.